I'm going to play that at a different time. Mark Sleboda is here. Mark, thank you for joining me. International Relations and Security Analyst, Mark Sleboda. How you doing, Mark?
Jamaro, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And my apologies for the time distortion effect.
It is perfectly fine. I understand. When it first happened, I was like, it's daylight savings time. I just know as soon as it happened, I was like, it's daylight savings time. No, man, thank you for joining me, Mark. I need to start with Russia, and let's start with Kursk. There seems to have been a complete and utter collapse of the Ukrainian military in the Kursk region. And apparently they've liberated, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 7 different settlements over that time period. There was this astonishing pipe thing in Sudzha, apparently, where the Russian soldiers went through a pipe and attacked the Ukrainian military from the pipe. Again, just mind-blowing military maneuvers on this. What is happening in Kursk right now? How much of Kursk is even left? From my understanding, there's some parts of Kursk where Russia has gotten to the border, in which case they are going to continue to move. What's happening? Give us some context.
Okay, so to say that there has been a complete collapse of the Ukrainian military position in we used to call it the Kursk incursion. Now it's just better to call it the Sudzha pocket, because that has been all that's left of it. That's not true. That it hasn't been a complete collapse, but there has been a major collapse, right? Of the Kiev regime forces positions to the north of Sudzha, right? And down into Sudzha itself. That it could end up within another week or two, possibly, right? That's an optimistic take of rolling up the entire thing, right? Because they've suffered a huge loss. Russia has a lot of momentum. But to say that right now the entire thing is gone would be, technically incorrect. So, back last fall, the Kiev regime launched their incursion into the Kursk region, almost certainly directed towards the Kursk nuclear power plant, and possibly a storage of tactical nuclear weapons that is also strongly rumored to be in the area as well. Now, other than that, the Kursk region was a backwater of the front, right? Very light defenses there, because other than that nuclear power plant, there's nothing there, right? There's nothing of any strategic value. It's literally lots of thick forests, small rivers, and small hamlets, right? So when they launched this incursion, it seemed to come as a bit of a surprise. There's some indication that Russia may have known about it beforehand and allowed it to occur because they viewed it as a strategic blunder of
Do you buy that? I've heard people make that argument.
I really don't know what to say, because it has to be said, if that is true, then several thousand Russian people were sacrificed, civilians were sacrificed as bait.
Which is why I don't believe it.
So I can't make a firm decision, yay or nay. There's a lot of conflicting information or I should say there's a complete dearth of information that gives me any firm say. But if Russia did not know about it significantly beforehand, then they certainly exploited it to the hilt, right? They certainly exploited it to the hilt. Because essentially all these Kiev regime forces of a military, the Kiev regime's military that has already had already been suffering severe manpower losses that continues to exacerbate, particularly as a result of this. They launched this incursion as an attempt to on one hand, again, their goal was probably the Kursk nuclear power plant. They never really got close to it, so Russian forces quickly moved in and prevented them from reaching anywhere near that far. And rather than retreat, they dug in and they made it. They created a narrative about it's diverting forces from the Donbass, which is absolute nonsense. Because actually, it was the Kiev regime that diverted forces from Donbass, from the Pokrovsk area and the like. And they're the ones with manpower shortages, not Russia. Russia had plenty of reserves that they were able to pull in to seal this thing up and then begin the walk back over the next half a year because they had plenty of reserves. So that's a false narrative. The idea that they were diverting forces is political justification that has no military reality. Then it became the justification that they were going to trade it once peace negotiations began for presumably, I don't know, Zaporozhye nuclear power plant if they had managed to reach the Kursk nuclear power plant. Okay, Russia made clear from the beginning there would not even be any negotiations until the Kursk region was recovered. There would be no trades. We don't need to make deals because we can take it all back. You can't hold it, right? And you made a strategic blunder by going in there. You came out of far more defendable positions, say in the Kiev area or forces drawn on from the Donbass area where there are actually fortifications. And you came to this forested area with a collection of small hamlets that has no big buildings for you to hide in, right? No place to keep troops, right? Keep them hidden from drones, from artillery, vehicles, and the like, without any fortifications, right? And if you want to keep shoving reinforcements into that, which is what the Kiev regime did for a half a year, then we'll be happy to attrit away these forces here in what essentially became a fire bag, right? An area where Russia was surrounding them on three sides and grinding ever closer to the middle. And they had to keep up a thin supply line using one or two roads up into Russian territory that was, increasingly and ever increasingly under fire. And already by December, about 40% of the Kursk insurgents had been retaken, right? And they had shrunk down to essentially a pocket around the town of Sudzha. Sudzha was the largest settlement that the Kiev regime was able to take. It was the largest settlement in the area. And to give you an idea of the size, when I say this area is a backwater, right, with hamlets, it's not a joke. The biggest settlement they were able to take had 4,000 to 5,000 people before the intervention began, right? 4 to 5, that's it, right? That's the biggest area. That's the urban metropolis of this incursion zone. But that was the best they had. So that became the center, the focal point. And as Russia began grinding away, and as of about 2 or 3 weeks ago, they had managed to not only shrink the incursion zone down to a pocket around Sudzha, but they had been coming in, cutting south to the east and to the west of Sudzha, narrowing that lifeline right down to the Ukrainian-Russian border, and then actually crossing it. And already for close to a month now, Russian forces have actually been on the Ukrainian side of the border. On the other side of this border here is the Sumy region. And in Sumy, again, it's kind of a provincial territory. There is a fairly large city there, Sumy, right, what the region is named of. But other than that, there's not a whole lot. And then from Sumy, there's a road that goes straight kind of southwestish to Kiev, to the Dnieper River and to Kiev. And actually, when Russia first intervened in 2022, this was one of the direction that they moved on Kiev. They came right through Sumy. They didn't even bother taking. They just drove around it. There weren't any serious defenses at the time, and they went right to Kiev. And when they withdrew, they went back this way. So the other argument of what that came very late in the day, like in the last 2 months, was that the Kiev regime couldn't pull forces out of here, because if they did, then Russia would follow them through and attack Kiev. And that much is probably true, right? And Russia may very well have been building up to that, right? Or planning that, as before the incursion began. So that's probably the most legitimate reason they have. But still, they could have been on their side of the border in fortifications rather than out in these hamlets and villages. They suffered terrible losses of Western military equipment and manpower. In fact, they, according to some of the estimates from the Russian Ministry of Defense, they actually lost more Western equipment in Kursk than they lost during the failed 2023 offensive against the Russian defensive lines in Zaporozhye, which gives you a scale of what the Western media, has been. The Western media was at first all excited. Oh, give it to the Russians, take it to the Russians. And then almost immediately there was a little nagging voice in the 4th or 5th paragraph on the 2nd page saying, some analysts question the strategic value of this, right? And we were saying it from the beginning, right? I said it. Okay, short-term tactical success, information warfare success, but ultimately it would be a huge strategic blunder. And that's exactly what it has turned into. So over the last 2 weeks, Russia has been tightening that noose, drawing close around this Sudzha pocket now, because that's about all that is left. And they had not physically cut the last road supply line into Sudzha, but they had it under very heavy drone and artillery control, right? Fire control, right? Which means that probably 80 to 90% of anything they tried to send either way got interdicted en route, wounded going one way, and all the ammunition, the supplies, reinforcements coming the other way. So a lot of people have already understood that the writing was on the wall. And the Kiev regime didn't have a lot of other good options, because we are now deeply in the mud season, the Rasputitsa, right? We've had a very warm, unseasonably warm February in Russia, right? Western Russia right now. It's about 10 degrees, right? Above zero. Very unusual for this time of year. And in Ukraine, it's 20 degrees above zero in some places, right? It's 60s, right? In the Fahrenheit weather. So it's just all mud, and you can't use fields. You can't use dirt country roads. You can't use these other routes. You're restricted to asphalt roads, which themselves are increasingly ground up by all these military vehicles and not very good for logistics to begin with. So they're starving them. They're cutting them off, and they've already went down and taken over bits of the Sumy region on the other side. And it was clear that this was going to be closed up. But then over this weekend, Russia accelerated this whole collapse of the Sudzha pocket with a special forces operation. And this is the 3rd time now they have done a pipeline special forces mission, right? The first one was at Avdiivka, and that was essential for the quick collapse of the defenses in Avdiivka. And then there was another one in Toretsk, and now this is the 3rd one. And the irony here is they used the Druzhba gas pipeline that up until January of this year had still been transporting natural gas to Europe, to Slovakia, to Hungary, right? and it was full of gas and LNG, right, in some cases, so wasn't available for something like that. But the Kiev regime, did not renew, that didn't try, right? The transit agreement had expired, and they weren't going to renew it, and they told Slovakia, "Suck it up." Right, you're not getting any more Russian energy, and Slovakia is swearing back at them. We're giving you electricity, you bastards, So all these words back and forth, and all the time Russians are like, "Yeah, baby, we got a secret way in now." No one, they haven't even thought it up yet. And here's one of the particular ironies: this pipeline featured in a James Bond film. I believe it was the Living Daylights, I think was the name, with Timothy Dalton, where they used this pipeline to get a defector, which was a Russian cellist who's the actress was Maryam Diabo with blonde hair. And her and James Bond basically used what was supposed to be a cleaning pod and went right through the pipeline, out of Russia, through the pipeline. So, I mean, in a way, this was already foreseen a few decades ago in a James Bond film. It's hilarious. So this pipeline, this Druzhba pipeline, this natural gas pipeline, is about 4 feet in diameter, right? 1.4 meters, right? So I think that's about 4 feet.
Yeah.
And parts, I mean, it was a harrowing, right? Complete darkness, very tight, lots of pockets of gas still in there. I have heard that, again, we don't have all the details yet, right? So a lot of it is talk, but that several people died. Several of the people on the Special Forces mission died from gas inhalation. In pockets still in, and the dangers of very severe claustrophobia. But basically, they sent 100 men, a company-sized Special Forces mission, 12 kilometers, right, behind Kiev regime lines, in this Sudzha pocket, basically through the whole north of the pocket area. A lot of very heavily fought over little hamlets that essentially don't exist anymore. And they came out the other side at a place where they could get out of. And now we're getting word that the Kiev regime didn't discover that they had succeeded in this until an hour and a half after they had come out. So they were able to solidify their positions. And then supposedly they got another 2 company-sized groups, so another 200 people. So a total of 300 Russian special forces suddenly popped up behind the Kiev regime's defensive lines, everything above Sudzha, right? Had been heavily fought over. And so when the Kiev regime discovered this, of course, they started wailing on it with artillery, with drones, with everything they had. And they made claims that they had wiped out the entire force and so forth. That is clearly not the case, right? Now, at least not before they completed their mission, right? I don't know how many people survived at this point. In fact, they themselves, they were operating under strict secrecy. They weren't allowed to tell their families what they had volunteer. This was all volunteer. They weren't allowed to tell their families. They were, there was a complete understanding that this was a suicide mission, that it was a one-way ticket. And they went anyway. They made messages to be sent to their families, right? After presumably they died.
This mission was that important, where they were willing to go on a suicide mission in order to accomplish
it. That's not fathomable to you and me sitting in our
armchairs. It's not. I mean, look, it's one thing.
This is Russian territory. This is unquestioned Russian territory. And they were willing to risk, above and beyond. But these are Russian Spetsnaz, right? This is Akhmat Special Forces. These guys are There are people in the U.S. Special Forces who would go on missions like this too.
No, I accept that. I guess my thought is,
Yeah.
look, I accept that when the mission is of massive importance, I need to save the world. I need to save the country. I need to. Okay, fair enough. I get that. Was this was it that important? I mean, what was? Let me ask this a different way. What was the main objective of this mission? Let's ask that.
Okay, so the main objective of this mission was exactly accomplished, right? Because when they dropped these 300 forces behind the lines, and then they were discovered, right? And the Kiev regime started wailing on them what they had. All the positions north of that suddenly, and Russia, of course, was jamming a lot of communications, right? Starlink doesn't work in Kursk, and Russia has already demonstrated the ability to at least temporarily locally shut down Starlink anyway, but they were relying on other communications. So there was a lot of confusion that they didn't know what was going on. All they saw was suddenly their own forces were firing behind their position, right? And when they discovered that the Russians were already behind them, that's it. Everyone north of that new Russian Special Forces incursion point where they emerged from the tunnel panicked, right? They fled their positions, and everything basically north of that collapsed, right? In very short order. So like you said, 6 or 7 settlements, and then it built on. And the Kiev regime had already been considering pulling out of some of these areas, right? Not Sudzha itself, probably for political reasons, but some of the outlying, the settlements around this pocket, because they just couldn't defend them anymore. Supplies were coming in too light. Russians were coming in heavy. It was all a matter of time. And they had actually wired, there's a number of small rivers, right? The Sudzha River, the Lyolka River, that cross this territory too. And they had actually mined them for so that if they had to retreat across them, they could blow them up and slow the Russian advancing forces down, buy themselves some more time. Well, the Russians knew this, and the Russians are very good at pontoon bridges at this point. They get them up like that. They don't care. So as part of this, they then sent drones in at these, they already knew, mined bridges behind the Kiev regime forces, and they blew up the bridges. So when some of these forces that were trying to get out now, they came to the Lyolka River, only to find that the bridge that they expected to cross no longer existed. And the Russians were ready. There's video of this. They just annihilated these convoys, right? They just completely annihilated them. A horrible, trap, right? So they walked right into it. The panic, they retreated. They walked into another trap trying to escape. Now, there were some of them that thank all the gods, surrendered, did the smart thing, and the number of POWs were taken. But all in all, the Kiev regime probably lost in excess of 1,000 men in one night, basically. And this is continuing on. We don't know exactly how much advances Russia has taken yet. We haven't gotten all the exact drone evidence or whatever for geopolitical confirmation for mappers, but even the Kiev regime admits, okay, this is a catastrophe. I mean, you've got their interlocutors online calling that all pipelines into European territory must be destroyed because Russians are using them for secret forces to penetrate our countries and the like. Never mind that this was all actual mainland Russian territory, and so forth. But a lot of panic, a lot of hair pulling and teeth gnashing and chest beating going on. But I mean, in the West, this is something that you only find out about if you're paying close attention to the conflict, and it will probably be buried deep in an 3 paragraphs in an article on clashes in the Kursk region, right, and stuff like that. In Russia, they're going to make movies about this special forces operation, right? Because this was, and like I said, this is the third one of these, right? That Russia has done, right? So, you know, crazy, heroic, you know, special forces stuff going on in this conflict. And it has to be said, some of it's happening on the other side too, but maybe not quite something this dramatic. And it is, you know, I believe that before any, let's say negotiations begin where Russia and Ukraine actually sit down at the table in the coming, you know, short to medium term future, which I'm not entirely sold on, right? I don't necessarily believe that. But let's say that Trump manages to arrange that. He gets Kiev on a leash and they agree to it, and Russia is like, well, okay, no ceasefire, but we'll sit down and talk, right? If that happens, I expect Kursk to already be rolled up by then, right?
Do you think that part of the reason that they accelerated was because they're expecting some kind of peace talks? Basically,
sure,
this is not going to be part of the negotiation.
Yeah, so this has been building for months already, right? It was clear that Russia, they had gotten what they wanted out of the Kursk fire bag, right? The Kiev regime had already suffered so much military damage. They were increasingly using civilian vehicles to transport troops around in the Kursk pocket because they didn't have enough infantry fighting vehicles or APCs left. And when you've done that, it's like, well, what utility is this fire bag for us? Time to start closing it up, right? That had already been ongoing, right? And of course, in the past week, there is all this political noise right now about Trump suspending military and supposedly intelligence aid to the Kiev regime, although there's lots of questions about whether that's actually being done or not. But it definitely creating a heightened sense of panic. Now, what I don't want people to walk away from, because I know this is going to be the mainstream narrative, that, oh, the Kiev regime could have held on to Kursk if it hadn't been for Trump betraying them. No. Don't try to weasel it out of this way. This has been building solidly for 2 or 3 months now. This pocket has ever been tightening. The timing was fortuitous, and the Russia, you know, certainly took advantage of that. It might have helped things along a bit, but I mean, this was Russian, you know, constriction of this pocket and this supply line over months. This was a Russian special forces operation. This wasn't Elon Musk and Kiev regime officials bad-mouthing each other over Twitter. Right. That is not the story about what happened. I know the Western mainstream media is going to do this. I mean, this is going to be the story, right? Trump betrayed Ukraine. They could have won, or they could have held on, right? Because this will be increasingly the narrative going forward from here, right?
By the way, they did that when Republicans were holding the Ukraine funding, and it was like, oh, Ukraine was doing so well until the Republicans held the funding, and all of a sudden it collapsed.
Russia has been on the offensive since the failed Kiev regime. You know, NATO planned a summer offensive towards the Sea of Azov in 2023. Russia has been winning decisively since then, right? They've been on the offensive. Yeah, you have this Kursk Fool's Crusade, which is what I called it, and what it definitely has turned out to be. And they suffered huge, because not only did they lose people in Kursk, but because they could have used those forces to defend, at least hold on to the Pokrovsk area, Ugledar, the south of Donbass. They could have held on to all of that longer at a much greater cost to the Russian forces, because they would have been fighting in fortified, defendable positions rather than these little forested hamlet areas. For again, no strategic value whatsoever. I mean, pure information war. At least at the end, that's all they had left to fight for. And you know, they're still not pulling troops out, right? I mean, the Kiev regime is doing what it always does. It waits past the point where you can safely withdraw these troops, and then it tries to send an emergency force in to batter open a way briefly to get out as many men as they can, which ultimately, even if it's successful, creates more casualties in getting that hole briefly open to get people out than it would have been if they had just left them there. And now they don't even really have that option, because the supply line is so heavily under fire and it's strung out into Russian territory, and the Russians are already down, it's essentially a cauldron, right? Not 100% completely a cauldron, but it is essentially, and it's deep into Russian territory where from the border where Sudzha still is. And there's no way. They're trying to drag reinforcements again, pulling them from the Donbass, from other areas to try to keep this pocket open. But morale is really low now on the Kiev regime side, and no one wants to get stuck behind the lines in Russian territory, because the Russians are probably not showing a lot of mercy, right? There are plenty of troops that are successfully surrendering, but I got to say, if you've got neo-Nazi Banderite tattoos and stuff on, you belong to Azov, something like that. I don't know how easily Russian forces are going to recognize that those guys want to surrender.
Yeah, they're going to have a bad day, to put it mildly.
I mean, they know.
Well, there's also the propaganda angle, right? When the Kursk incursion first happened, CNN came on with one general after the next saying, this is fantastic. This shows that Zelensky is on it. He is this military genius. He's the new Winston Churchill. And that they still got the pizzazz about him. And I remember being on the show saying, okay, those people are going to get killed or they're going to get pushed out. There's not going to be any two ways about it. I would imagine that from Zelensky's point of view, this is humiliating. And the moment that all of those people... It's going to
do a lot of political damage to his position at a time when the Trump administration is already trying to push him out, right? This huge fracas in the White House, this news in Politico and elsewhere that Trump is talking to other Ukrainian politicians, the demand for elections, calling Zelensky a dictator, then walking it back a bit, but typical Trump style, I guess, if you want to call it that, contradictions. But he's clearly in a weakening position. And yes, he had this rally where all the Europeans, vice Hungary and Slovakia, stood around him and like, oh, did Daddy US yell at you? Oh, don't worry, we love you. Mommy Europe still loves you, right? Stand strong, be brave, be fearless. We protect you, blah, 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 right? And everyone in the back of their heads, just that conversation that occurred during that week earlier between Trump and Keir Starmer, when Macron and Keir Starmer tried to come and get promises from Trump about security guarantees and the like that Trump wasn't going to give them. Trump at one point interrupted Keir Starmer and said, really? So you can take on the Russians alone, huh? And everyone in the room nervously laughed. Right?
Everybody
I think we popped that. You popped that video when we talked about it before. And that's the situation, right? Europe, again, they can drag this out a little longer, but they can't replace either the military or the financial or the intelligence. If the intelligence, even some degree of it, is being withheld, right? Some of it may be getting to the Kiev regime anyway. The British may be giving it to them, right? Even though Trump told them not to. The other things are happening. But even if it's being disrupted, that's already significant, because people really do not understand how important and how big a role U.S. Satellite information, signals intelligence, all of this has been, and to sustaining the Kiev regime for 3 years, right, in the fight. That would have been wrapped up much, much quicker, right? And we're talking within the first year, almost certainly. But some of us knew the U.S. would get involved. And Elon Musk has been going off on social media, angrily reacting to attacks, pointing out that if his Starlink wasn't used, the Kiev regime, would already be gone, right? And he is only slightly exaggerating the role that Starlink has played, because it has been extremely important. They operate their drones off of Starlink, right?
Okay.
And they have a lot of problems, because of Russian electronic warfare and jamming. And Russia has already demonstrated the ability to locally shut down Starlink for that and other purposes, but it's always an arms race, right? Electronic warfare arms race between Musk's team running Starlink and the Russian military about keeping Starlink up. But if they didn't have that, it would GG well played.
Two questions for you. I know you are very skeptical about whether or not there's going to be, let's say, a peace deal. But the fact that Trump is killing intelligence, and as you pointed out, the role that intelligence plays in this war and the significance of it, killing weapons, or let's say support.
Okay, now it has to be said that both Russians and Ukrainians on the ground are saying that the intelligence flow largely continues.
Fair enough.
I can't confirm that, but I take something when I hear Russian forces on the ground saying they're still getting all the satellite data. We know they are, right? Compared to Trump saying it and the British saying in the back pages of the Financial Times, we're going to give it to them anyway. F you, Trump, right? I have to go with the guys on the ground. So I would like it to be shut off, right? I haven't seen conclusive evidence. I would say that it is likely, to some degree at least, that the normal flow of information has been disrupted. And I would point out that there have been no long-range missile attacks into Russia since Trump took office. That already there is a significant walk back from World War III, right? Because Russia was ready to start firing missiles at U.S. bases around the world, right? They were absolutely, we reserve the right. And the only thing that was stopping them from doing that was knowing that Trump was going to take office in a couple of months. And trying to provoke them. And that Trump right away said, that's crazy. That's World War III stuff, even before he took office. So
it does seem that Trump is moving in a particular direction.
Yeah. There's a trend. It's not deniable at all, right? And he has gone much further, it has to be said, than I ever thought he would, right? And I have largely given up on predicting Trump, because one day Zelensky's a dictator, and the next day, did I say that? That doesn't sound like something I'd say, right? He's doing much more than I thought he would, but there has to be a limit to what he can and won't do, because we're lucky that both the Kiev regime, that both Zelensky and the Europeans, to a larger extent, Zelensky, are playing this dumb, right? If they were smart, all they would have to do is say, okay, you pulled my arm, I'll sit down to talks. We're ready for a ceasefire, and then turn to Russia and say, ceasefire? And Russia says, no. We said no. And then it's Russia who is responsible for the peace process not moving forward. They're too stupid to do that, right? Yeah. Yes, there's domestic political concerns that the ultranationalists, the Banderites, would go off the handle and so forth. Yeah, and that's probably a concern. But they could play this diplomatically so much smarter, right? That whole fracas in the White House was completely unnecessary. I had initially, until I saw the full 50 minutes, thought that it might have been an ambush by Trump and Vance. Yeah, but it wasn't. If you watch the whole thing, it's quite clear. Zelensky, deliberately, he was frustrated and desperate. He was entitled, right? And he's a spoiled brat, and he expects to be given what he wants. And he doesn't understand that this administration does not agree with the narrative that the Biden administration had been operating under for 3 years, and to wake up to that. Now, can he continue to keep aid from flowing, military, financial, intelligence aid from flowing to Kiev at some point when Trump is demanding a ceasefire before negotiations? Russia is absolutely firm. We've been down this road before. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Istanbul, no more ceasefires. We get a final deal, right? And only then, which it must be said was actually what happened in the negotiation process in the Vietnam War as well, right? The North Vietnam, they refused. They said no ceasefire, right? They weren't interested in a ceasefire. And negotiations continued for years while the fighting continued until they finally reached a deal and the U.S. announced their withdrawal and everything collapsed. You could draw similar conclusions from what happened in Afghanistan, right? Mm-hmm. Trump began negotiations with the Taliban, completely ignoring the U.S. installed regime in Kabul, right? And they were saying, we don't want a peace deal. You can't leave us. And they were completely ignored by both Trump and then in the end by Biden, right? And they dealt with the Taliban over their proxy's head. And if there had been any smart people in Kiev, they would have seen this pattern to U.S. behavior, where when they decide to cut and run, that the proxy is going to be strung out, right? So that seems likely. Now, that said, Keir Starmer and Macron are going to be evidently going back to Washington again this week with, begging, cajoling. I don't know. Do they have blackmail? I don't know, right? Doing the same thing again, trying to pull the U.S. back into this conflict to one degree or another, right? They keep demanding, Kiev demands security guarantees for themselves. The Europeans are like, well, we'll put troops on the ground. We'll give them security guarantees as long as you give us security guarantees. Because everyone knows that our forces can't stand against the Russians, and likely the Americans can't as well. And the Americans know that. Not here, not now, right? Not under these conditions. And that's why they're not willing to. But it amounts to the same thing. If you give security guarantees to European NATO forces and they put troops on the ground, and oops, the Ukrainian forces arrange for some kind of violation of the ceasefire, then suddenly it's literal World War III. And there's plenty of Europeans that are perfectly willing to risk that.
These stupid idiots keep starting third world wars. I was telling somebody else that. I was like,
well, you guys Biden was willing to risk that. Well, it has to be said, Biden never promised security guarantees either. Right? He did lots of things, but he didn't write anything on paper, right? He refused to give formal security guarantees to Ukraine either. So a lot of this political now fire on Trump from the media and so forth in the U.S., they easily forget that Biden or Biden's corpse's handlers refused to do the same thing while Biden's corpse was still in office, up until January of this year as well. So that's just internecine domestic politics in the U.S. as usual.
Last question, Mark. About a minute. In Syria, Russia opened its military base to allow many of the minority communities in the base that were effectively being slaughtered by HTS.
Let's say Al-Qaeda. Say the word, right? There is no Syrian government. Al-Qaeda. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is Al-Qaeda. The U.S. government admitted they were Al-Qaeda. They're still listed as a terrorist organization in the United States and in the United Nations. Al-Qaeda is in control of Syria, and Al-Qaeda is committing a genocide of ethno-religious minorities in Syria against the Alawites, against the Christians, against the Druze, and the entire Western mainstream media is playing a game of whitewashing and apologia and ignoring, see no evil, hear no evil, fear no evil, under clashes with Assad loyalists and all of this type of nonsense.
That is the way that they're trying to describe it here in the United States. Assad loyalists are fighting.
They are going house to house and killing people, dragging them out into the street in their socks and slippers and shooting them all en masse in front of their houses, right? This is clearly happening. The videos are all over Twitter. There's no question about this. Even the jihadists defenders like Charles Lister and the like are commenting, well, they're Assad loyal. All Alawites are Assad loyalists and basically deserve it, right? That's what they're saying. So, I mean, Russia can't do anything at this point. I mean, this was inevitable when they stopped, when the Syrian Arab army was bought out, sold out, co-opted. Its generals stood down. Its troops told, lay down your weapons, take off your uniforms, run away and go home. When that happened, this was inevitable. This was always just a matter of time until it happened. And the new leader of Syria, right, al-Julani or al-Shara, as they're calling him now, check him out, because the Western mainstream media ignores this. Even Wikipedia admits it. This guy was once the leader of ISIS in Syria. He was once the leader of a high-ranking member of Jabhat al-Nusra, which was another rebranding of Al-Qaeda. And now he is for years he was the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is another rebranding of Al-Qaeda in Syria. He is literally today's Osama bin Laden.
Yes,
right?
He's a headshot. I mean, he's a literal headshot.
He is a literal Sunni jihadist, Wahhabist, and I mean, it's just it was all the way back to Jake Sullivan in this email, that we've all seen from the Snowden releases. Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, and they pulled one out, with a big role from Turkey, it must be said. I ultimately, at least right now, regard Erdogan as more responsible for all of this than the United States. I'm sure the US and Israel and the UK and France all had their fingers in it, but 90% of this was Erdogan, right? He's an Islamist himself. He has always been with us. And what's happening now is primarily himself. But Al-Qaeda won. Al-Qaeda now has Syria. And yes, there has been an uprising in the Lataki area, right, of people who are, already living under the repression of Al-Qaeda, and they don't want, and they were rising up, and so they sent the dogs in. And the dogs, of course, are not just killing, the actual people who were fighting, right? They're now going through and just wiping out all the Alawites, all the Syrian Christians, right? Village to village, wiping out entire settlements. And what we're seeing is only the tip of the iceberg, because we are seeing primarily the videos that these jihadist monsters are taping and uploading to the internet themselves because they're proud, right? This is genocide, right? Forget this noise Uyghur nonsense, right? That, the US, this is actual genocide. And right now, certainly the European governments and the mainstream media are involved in a huge whitewashing and apologia. And they're just the Alawites and Christians in Syria. We never cared about them anyway, because they were always on the other side. And
they don't call them that. They said they're Assad loyalists. That's the way they described them in the US media. Assad loyalists, which
Tulsi Gabbard, though, during her confirmation hearings, warned of exactly this. She said it outright. Al-Qaeda is in charge of Syria, and this is going to be the result. So I'm very interested to see what comes out of the Trump administration on this, because I know Tulsi Gabbard is on the right side of it, if no one else.
Mark Sleboda, international relations security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. You can follow him on his YouTube channel at Real Politics with Mark Sleboda, and you can find him on Facebook.com/Gramsci Mark. Thank you, my man. Always appreciate it.
May I have one more word?
Go for it.
This was always inevitable when the Syrian Arab army gave up, right? Whatever the economic conditions, yes, they stopped defending their state. And this was the state that, however flawed, protected the ethno-religious minorities in Syria from exactly what is happening now. Now the people are paying the price of not fighting to defend that state. This is exactly why Hobbes wrote the Leviathan, right?
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with realist international relations political theory, you need to read Hobbes, right? The state is the Leviathan. It's not a good thing, but human beings, being what they are, life without the state is nasty, brutish, and short. And the organization of the state ultimately is the only thing that can protect you from your crazy, drugged up, jihadi, etc. neighbor. This is why the Leviathan is a grim necessity. And if you fail to defend that state, well, then this is the result. That's why I'm a statist.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it, Mark. I'm going to pick that book up. I'm going to read that book. I'm familiar with the term Hobbes' choice. I even use that, man. I will find this book and I will read this book. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it, man. Be safe.